When you are setting up your potentially your health promotion initiative, or you're maybe working with clients or groups where one of the potential outcomes is for them to increase their physical activity levels, it's good to have reference amounts or reference guidelines for you to consult as far as how to recommend physical activity. And then if we're designing a potential health promotion program, we also need like thresholds of like physically active versus physically inactive that we can perhaps measure success with that program against. So in this unit, I want to talk about the physical activity recommendations for adults. So we're talking about people between the ages of 18 and 64. And then again, when you're working with your population, when you're working with your clients, when you're working with your groups, if that's your future, you really do want to customize from there. But this gives us some baseline values, baseline reference values that we can work with. Okay, so Canada has now moved to a 24-hour movement guideline for adults aged 18 to 64. So the previous set of recommendations, which I'll reference in a second, really just focused on physical activity, but now the focus is on what we're doing in a 24-hour period. And what I like about this graphic and how it's organized is it kind of shows what we should be getting more of and what we should be getting less of. So we should be getting more moderate to vigorous physical activity. We should be getting more, in general, light physical activity. In general, we should be getting more sleep. And in general, we should be getting less sedentary behavior. Okay, so when I say more, what do I mean by that? And obviously there's sometimes too much. We don't want to sleep 18 hours a day either, unless we're an infant. So what are the specific numbers that are associated with these guidelines? So as far as physical activity goes, the recommendation is 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. It used to be, the former recommendation used to be that had to be accumulated in at least 10-minute intervals, 10-minute bouts as it was called. But now we've taken that requirement for at least 10 minutes at a time to just any 150 minutes. So you could get 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, 3 minutes there, 10 minutes there, half an hour there, and that all adds up to 150 minutes potentially. So moderate to vigorous, we're talking about something that gets the heart rate up. It is also recommended to get at least 2 days a week of movements that build muscles, resistance type training, and then several hours, I got this right. Several hours of light physical activities as well is part of this recommendation. It doesn't get specific on the number, but just like you should also, beyond your like 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous, getting that heart rate, up so you can feel it. Depends on the person what that number is. But usually it's about over 100 beats per minute, 120 beats per minute is something that's more in that moderate to vigorous range. But we also want to get to activities where we're just like moving around more throughout our days, including standing. As far as sleep recommendation for adults 18 to 64, which is most of y'all watching this video, the recommendation is 7 to 9 hours, right? And then limit sedentary time to 8 hours or less per week. That sounds like a lot, but it adds up really quickly. I hate getting my screen time reports at the end of the week. I just got mine right now and I'm always like, ooh. So this, I'm pretty good with physical activity myself. I'm pretty decent these days at sleep, but sedentary behavior and especially screen time, no more than 3 hours of recreational screen time per day, and getting up and moving a little bit to break up your day as well. That's what's recommended. I don't know if I meet those recommendations. So what I like about these movement guidelines, well, first of all, I'll just show you how they're a bit different than the former guidelines. The former guidelines, like I said, they're pretty similar. They're just like designed differently, and they didn't really talk about sleep. They just really focused on that recommendation of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. But the big difference was that it was suggested to be done in bouts, in intervals of like 10 minutes or more. But the recommendation for muscle building exercise is the same, and they also said more is better. And then they got into like some examples of what this might look like. But in the former recommendations, there was no mention of sleep, and there was also no mention of sedentary behavior. So I think this is a really important update to these recommendations. And I actually, just one thing I wanted to highlight of the current recommendation as well. I love this, and we'll get back to this in a bit. Progressing towards any of these targets will result in some health benefits. So it's not like, well, I can't make it to 150, so I'm just going to give up, right? If you're at 0 and you get to 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per week, that's such a mouthful. That's good. That's amazing. That's great. We don't want to just tell people if you don't get to 150 minutes, you should just give up, right? So any increase is usually a good thing as long as we're not hurting ourselves and we have enough energy availability. Okay, so like I just showed, there are these older physical activity recommendations, and now that new recommendation that just came out that took out the fact that physical activity has to be accrued, that moderate to vigorous physical activity has to be done in at least 10 minutes at a time. So now that we've taken it out, it's actually really interesting. The percentage of Canadians that meet the recommendations skyrocketed to about 50% of Canadians. With the old recommendation, only about 20% of people were meeting that recommendation. Whereas with the new recommendation, just like get that time in, doesn't have to be 10 minutes at a time, right? Without the 10-minute session requirement, the amount of Canadians meeting those physical activity recommendations, like I said, went up significantly. So we're at about 50%. And unsurprisingly, the age group of younger individuals is higher. And we also see the percentage of people meeting physical activity is higher in the male group than in the female group. In addition to that 24-hour movement guideline that I just went over, what's great is if you go to the CSEP website, the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology website, not only do they have that document, they have a bunch of other different documents that can be helpful to setting recommendations, but also to clinical practice as well. So we also see in this recommendations physical activity guidelines for individuals with multiple sclerosis, for individuals that are pregnant, for individuals with spinal cord injury, as well as how, as potentially a health promoter at the one-to-one level or the group level, how we can actually use these recommendations within a counseling practice, which is something we'll look at later on when we talk about coaching and counseling and motivational interviewing in particular. So you don't have to know all the specifics in those guidelines except for the recommendations for individuals that are pregnant, right? So basically the first recommendation is that all people that are pregnant without like a contraindication, so there's no other medical reason that you can't be physically active, we do recommend physical activity throughout pregnancy. Honestly, one of the big ones is about regulating blood sugar and making sure that that individual doesn't develop gestational diabetes, which is a risk factor for type 2 diabetes later in life and can also affect the unborn child too, their future health. It also helps reduce the risk of like pregnancy-associated hypertension, helps to manage BMI, but being physically active can help to mitigate some of those potential risks. Okay, so same recommendation for adults, 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, at least 3 days a week, but being active at least every other day is encouraged. Variety of aerobic types activities, but adding like yoga and stretching, prenatal yoga, a lot of women do that to help with the whole process and keeping the body feeling a little bit better during pregnancy. They also recommend, I love this, they also recommend pelvic floor exercise like Kegels, if you've heard of those, to strengthen those different muscles associated with the pelvic floor that can become less tight as the baby pushes through there, and can lead to, when those muscles lose their firmness, their responsiveness, that can increase the risk for like incontinence later in life. So we want to keep that pelvic floor strengthened. And if a pregnant person experiences any kind of lightheadedness, etc., obviously stop, maybe consult with your doctor as well. So like I mentioned, what I love about these new physical activity recommendations is that they focus on the whole day instead of just like, 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity a week. Well, a week is split up into days, and a day is split up as well. And all of these, sleeping, sedentary time, and movement, they're kind of related to each other. The more sleep we do, so the more we sleep, perhaps the less time, if we're oversleeping, perhaps the less time we have to be physically active, and the more time we spend in sedentary behaviors. And counterintuitively, often the more we sleep, if we're sleeping like 14 hours a day, 12 hours a day, that's a lot, you might actually feel more tired, right? And that might lead to more sedentary time, and that might lead to even less physical activity. Conversely, if you're not sleeping enough, you can also be really tired. And maybe because you do that, you spent a lot more time sitting and a lot less time being physically active. And another way you think of it is the more active you are, often, as long as you're not being active right before you go to sleep, depending on the person, but for most people, the more active we are, often the better we sleep as well. And all of these things are related. So I love this. And when Mark Tremblay, who was the lead author on this particular paper, but who's like a dynamo in the health promotion world, especially when it comes to physical activity, when he was talking about this document at the Canadian Obesity Summit, he was saying how like some people don't like to be counseled to be physically active, and that sometimes is a hard sell. So maybe with those individuals, we actually focus on reducing sedentary behavior. Or with those individuals, we focus on increasing sleep time. Or we do a little bit of everything because they are all related to each other. Okay? And just to show you also how this document is organized, this inner ring gives you a little bit more quantitative measures of how quantitative values that can help us measure whether someone is sleeping, doing sedentary behavior, or physical activity. So sleeping is about 1 MET, metabolic equivalent. Sedentary behavior is under 1.5 METs during waking hours. And then physical activity is anything above 1.5 METs. And ideally, we also want to get more vigorous physical activity that can be further divided up. And then this outer ring actually gives you like different postural ways that you can do these activities. So for instance, sleeping is usually doing sitting, reclining, or lying. Same with sedentary behaviors. But you can also do physical activity whilst sitting, reclining, or lying as well, especially if someone has some sort of movement issue. Perhaps they have a disability, and there's movements that we can also do while we're sitting as well, but usually physical activity is standing, or I don't know what other is, maybe swimming can count as that as well. So I alluded to this earlier, and a good question to ask is, are these physical activity thresholds actually needed in order to promote health? Like, do we have to tell people that you have to meet 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity in order to promote health? And I would actually argue no, and we kind of said that earlier as well, that as a general rule, more is better. Clinically relevant health benefits for a wide range of medical conditions can be accrued at volumes of physical activity that are well below recommendations. So someone that's like has a medical condition, or even just doesn't, or wants to reduce the risk of a future medical condition, going from 0 minutes of physical activity to 20 minutes of physical activity a week, or 30 or 40 or 50, even if they don't cross that 150-minute threshold, that is awesome. And then if you're using some of this information to figure out the evaluation of your program, that's something that you really want to figure out in the early stages. And part of what you're going to ask yourself is, where is this population now? Where's this population now, and what is a realistic place for them to get to? And it's just more enough. And then how are you going to measure more? So something else this document says is that threshold-centered physical activity messaging that says that you can only get health benefits above 150 minutes is not evidence-based and might provide a significant barrier to those that could see health improvements by getting more. Right? So the message here is like, just be careful with these recommendations. There's a purpose to them, and we can use them when we're doing research, and they're good thresholds to kind of keep in mind for yourself or maybe in a coaching practice. But you always want to work with your people, with your population, with your person to figure out where are they starting from and what's a realistic place for them to end up during a period of time. So this next slide just kind of reiterates what I just said, but puts it in graphical form. Using threshold-based recommendations for physical activity kind of suggests that if an individual is inactive or unfit, the risk of chronic disease or premature death is high at all levels of physical activity until they hit 150. And then risk of disease, etc., goes down. But that's not true. So if you have a lower activity level, just even going from inactive to a little bit active, that can actually produce such a dramatic slope, such a dramatic change in a person's health risk compared to someone that's already active who's like becoming even more active. That's such smaller of a slope as far as the risk for premature death and chronic disease as well, right? So more is better, and what is sometimes found is that we often focus our health promotion efforts or our counseling efforts on individuals that are already active, and we're trying to get them to be even more active. But as far as promoting health in the population, we would get so much further as far as total absolute health of the population, whatever that means, if we were to be able to get people that are at these very low levels of physical activity to just increase their physical activity by even a little bit. Even 20%, 30%, 40% can make a huge difference in their overall risk for disease. So that gives a bit of an overview of the physical activity recommendations for adults ages 18 to 64, a little bit of an emphasis on pregnancy, but also recommending that it's not just about getting to a particular threshold. Any level of physical activity that increases above baseline, that's not promoting illness, that's, conscious of energy availability, that's like not harmful to the person or injury promoting at all. Usually more is better, especially if someone is starting at a low level as well. So in the next few units, I'll talk about physical activity with children, for older adults, and for Indigenous individuals as well. So we'll see you in the next module.